everyone. Welcome to our panel, which is going to focus on reception and integration of refugees. My name is Mehtap. I'm a senior researcher at the ETUI, and I will moderate this panel. As we talk here and now, refugees somewhere in the world, in Europe, elsewhere, are going through dangerous routes and trying to cross border to save their lives, as well as those of their dependents. They leave behind loved ones, belongings, to start a new journey as the destination they arrive. But things are not always smooth, we know, and integration in particular is a bumpy road. In this panel, we will reflect on the particular refugee wave from Ukraine as a result of the war since February 2022, and discuss their reception and integration outcomes. While doing that, we will also look back to previous waves and previous episodes of refugee arrivals, in Europe in particular, from the same or different country of origin, and also in different destinations. And to talk about this, we will have an excellent line of speakers today with us, 3 speakers from different academic and policy backgrounds. And each speaker will have about 12 minutes or so, maximum 15, to kick off the debate. And after that, I will open the floor to interaction between speakers and also take questions from the audience, and if possible, also from the online participants. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, who is joining us remotely today. And I really appreciate that you are making the effort to join us today. I know your special circumstances. So, Yulia Kosyakova. Yulia is a senior researcher in the Migration and International Labor Studies Department at the Institute for Employment Research in IAB in Germany. Her current research interests are economic disadvantage and integration of refugees and other immigrants, gender and social inequalities. She has a PhD from the European University Institute in Italy, and she will give us an overview of Ukrainian refugees in Germany and provide some evidence with Germany's experience in integrating them. She will also touch upon some lessons learned from the previous wave in 2015. So, Yulia, the floor is yours.
Oh, I can immediately start. Thank you. I'll share my screen. Okay. Can you see that?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very honored to be here and to share some thoughts or some initial results on the consequences of the war in Ukraine for migration and integration and the lessons learned from 2015. So, I mean, there is nothing new what I will say now, but to start with, we face now the largest refugee migration since the great movements of refugees and displaced persons at the end of World War II in such a short period of time. Currently, the UNHCR recorded 7.3 million border crossings from Ukraine, but there were also roughly 2.3 million border crossing to Ukraine, which we could define as probably return migration. And in Europe, there are 4.8 million refugees recorded. And the majority of refugees from Ukraine concentrate on bordering countries of the EU, like Poland, Romania, and Slovakia, but also Russia and Moldova. However, also Germany has a pronounced number of Ukrainian refugees. So there are no exact numbers for a moment. So, for example, the Central Register of Foreigners report about 766,000 registered Ukrainian refugees since the beginning of war and until mid of May. The new system, FREE, which was developed specifically for registration of Ukrainian refugees, report higher numbers, and both systems may underestimate or overestimate the stock of refugees, on the one hand due to imperfect recording, but also due to double counting or under recording. And following federal police, we face 2,000 to 3,000 entries per day. What we know about demographics. So first of all, open borders with the European Union and a ban for men aged 18 to 60 to leave the country changed migration demographics as compared to 2015. So at the moment, the 40% of refugees from Ukraine in Germany are children and adolescents, 80% of adult refugees are women, and 12% of refugees are older people. I would say, I would be happy to say something on level of education, but at the moment there is no representative data for Ukrainian refugees. It will come soon, but there is nothing now. However, we can infer a little bit from the distribution of education in Ukraine. So for example, the Ukraine reports higher gross enrollment rates in tertiary education compared to Germany. For instance, 83% of adults were enrolled in tertiary education in Ukraine compared to 74% in Germany. Also, when we look on the previous migrants in Germany from Ukraine, they show higher levels of education. The share of those with tertiary degrees is 50%. So among people from Ukraine with own migration experience, this is reduced to 30% by persons without migration experience. And also, the theory also suggests that Ukrainians should be, or Ukrainian migrants should be favorably selected. Previous research shows that migrants or refugees in destination countries have higher educational level compared to a population who stayed behind, or the average level of population in the origin country. And also the more distant country or destination country, the greater is the geographical distance, the stronger is educational selectivity. What we know about labor market participation, again, there is no representative data for Germany now, but when we look on the labor force participation in Ukraine before the war, we observed that the labor force participation is slightly lower than in Germany, and there are slightly more pronounced gender differences. On the other hand, probably you know that in Germany, the majority of working women work part-time, and this is much less pronounced in among working population in Ukraine. So this kind of provides some good perspectives for integration. The previous experience with integration of Ukrainians in Germany is mixed. So there are, following official statistics, Ukrainian nationals show lower employment rates compared to Germans. On the other hand, if we look on the data from microcensus and we consider not only those nationals, but also people who arrived or have migration background from Ukraine. So for example, they are Germans now, their employment rates are much higher. What we also learned from the data is that labor market integration took quite a long time, but then is at the end of at a higher level. In contrast to that, level of German language skills has risen relatively quickly among migrants from Ukraine. And in regard to gender aspects, we observed that labor market integration by women took a little bit longer time than by men, which is probably dependent, correlates with family constellations. To infer on the integration prospects of Ukrainian migrants, we should consider the uncertainties, so because there is a uncertainty in regard of conditions in Ukraine and the course of the war, there is no certainty about migrations and return migration decisions compared to the flight movements in 2015. And many refugees still have partners and nuclear family members in Ukraine, which could also affect strongly integration perspectives. Also, there is higher uncertainty in regard, or the higher uncertainty could affect integration into the labor market and society, because it depends on investment in language and into country-specific human capital, and there is a great uncertainty about the perspectives to stay. For policymakers, it is important to consider the trade-off between a rapid and sustainable labor market integration and define the policies correspondingly. So there are advantages of quick labor market integration. Of course, there is a psychological stabilization, financial independence, the potential of remittances, so transfers to her home country. But also it could be that there will be little devaluation of personal human capital in case of quick return to Ukraine. The disadvantage is, of course, that faster labor market entry is often coupled with worse or lower wages and lower occupational prestige of the job. If we consider benefits of slower but sustained labor market integration, it includes and requires acquisition of language skills and other country-specific human capital, recognition of qualification, but this then in turn generates greater chances for skill-appropriate employment, higher earnings, employment stability, and quality of employment relationships. So what we have learned from 2015, first of all, one of the major aspects of refugee integration concerns registration and legal status. Many refugees in 2015 faced very long asylum procedures and their long periods of legal uncertainty. And this in turn hinders integrations in terms of less investments in host country specific human capital, such as language acquisition or educational investments, but also reduces employment opportunities. And then if we infer from that on the current situation, the positive message is that the activation of the EU Mass Influx Directive for Ukrainian refugees and temporary residence permit creates legal certainty in the short term and also prevents thereby these integration obstacles because there is no asylum procedure. However, at least in Germany, from the integration perspective, longer residence perspectives would be beneficial. At the moment, Ukrainian refugees receive 1 year to 2 years residence permit, and to achieve sustainable integration, we would need longer perspectives, at least of 3 years, because language investments and so on takes a lot of time. Another important aspects of refugees integration refers to regional distribution. So in many newly arrived refugees currently concentrate in Berlin and Bavaria, and mainly in large cities. And this could result in shortages in accommodation supply, which could lead to state-based redistribution. And if we look on the state-based redistribution of refugees in 2015, there were rather negative experiences or negative lessons learned. First of all, the distribution was above the average to structurally weak regions, which significantly hindered integration. And then also so-called residency requirements reinforced this. At the ERB, we developed a proposal in regard to regional distribution of Ukrainians. First of all, it should be minimized to persons who need public accommodation and new arrivals, and also individual preferences like family ties, friends, and professional contacts should be considered. And then distribution criteria should include local, so regional labor market situation, childcare infrastructure, because we have now to deal with a lot of women with children, and also housing costs. And following our simulation, it can increase employment rates by 5%. Also, what we have to consider in current situation is the childcare and integration of women. The current family constellation require new integration strategies, and female refugees face a lot of obstacles in the labor market. Here we have to prioritize the integration of children and young people in daycare centers, kindergartens, schools, and also their childcare infrastructure should be expanded, of course. Their integration services like language courses could be linked with childcare places. We have very good experience with that with previous refugees. And also the state or policymakers could mobilize potential of teachers and educators via flexible handling of the regulation of teaching and educator professions. And finally, other policy requirements, what we learned that language support is very important for refugees integration as well. Likewise, the recognition of professional qualification, both have a positive effects of employment and wages. There also acquisition of vocational and university education and lifelong learning, and also labor market programs and counseling. And here the positive message is that in Germany since June, Ukrainian refugees are directly integrated into so-called SGB II, which facilitates labor market integration through integration into support structure of job centers. However, this transition from one system to another creates, of course, longer procedures and can deploy integration process. The take-home message from my side is that at the moment we have, first of all, no reliable data, but it is forthcoming in summer. We start survey of Ukrainian refugees. It will be a representative survey. We have favorable integration conditions and prospects if we consider education and labor market experience of Ukrainian refugees. And also diverse experiences from 2015 should not be ignored. And integration is always a two-sided process, and success depends largely on integration efforts from the state, politics, administration, and education system, but also population. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julia. It was extremely interesting, and I'm really happy to hear that you're actually going to publish the survey or at least do some studies with it, because this is going to be the first representative one, right? If I understand.
Yes.
Well. This is very interesting because our knowledge is mostly based on anecdotal evidence, and so it's going to be a very good evidence base to draw some conclusions of what's going on and to know what's going on. So thank you very much for all the things. I mean, I've taken a lot of notes. I think you've raised very important issues also among the lessons learned, hopefully learned, and perhaps mistakes not to be remade this time. Also from the, when you mentioned the distribution, you know, certain aspects to be paid attention to, family ties and also the accommodation shortages. So very interesting aspects. I hope some people will hear about these things and pay attention to those. And one last comment, and then I'll go to Semi. I think the woman perspective, the gender perspective there is quite important, because we are not, let's say, have a huge reputation of integrating women in general in the labor markets. So now we are talking about a triple penalty, right? Woman, being a woman, being a migrant, and then being a refugee migrant. So, and actually maybe I could even add the fourth dimension, having young kids or having kids with you without your partner here. So we are talking about a very particular population here, so it's really requires very delicate and very careful measures to be able to integrate them, both in the society and in the labor market. So thank you very much. So with that, I would like to pass the floor to Semih, and let me briefly introduce him to you all. Semih Tümen is a professor of economics at TED University in Turkey, and also a research fellow at IZA in Germany. This is also where we met when I used to work there before. His current interest is mainly on investigating the education, labor market, and product market consequences of forced displacement. And he has a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. And today he will provide us a brief overview of integration of outcomes of Syrian refugees in Turkey. So different context, different refugee group, but he will also discuss the impacts of the refugees had that might have in the receiving country. So this is from the Turkish experience, but I think it will be very useful to draw some lessons, despite the fact that there are differences that we are all aware of. And yeah, with that, I leave the floor to Semih. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Mehtap, for the introduction. And I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me here to this panel, which is, I think, on a very important topic and is also very timely. So the title of my presentation is, so let me check whether this works or not. Yes, it works. So the title of my presentation is Socio-economic Integration of Refugees, Evidence and Lessons Learned from Syrian Refugees in Turkey. So two disclaimers before I start. The first one is that the evidence that I'm going to discuss today will draw on my own research and, well, of course, my co-authors. So others may disagree, but I firmly believe that, I mean, there is now a consensus in the literature, and the views that I'm going to provide will reflect the average opinion in the literature. And the second one is that, well, I'm going to focus on the case of Syrian refugees in Turkey. So, but it is substantially different from the case of Ukrainian refugees in Europe. So it may not be straightforward to bridge immediate similarities between these two cases, but it doesn't mean that there are no lessons learned, right? So at the end of my presentation, I will also discuss the potential lessons learned from the Syrian refugees in Turkey for the Ukrainian crisis. So this is the outline of my talk. I will start with a brief introduction where I'm going to give some statistics and some figures for Syrian refugees in Turkey, describe their characteristics, etc. And then I'm going to cover the studies investigating the impact of Syrian refugees on various socioeconomic outcomes in Turkey. Then I will discuss the main mechanisms driving those impacts. I'm going to highlight one main mechanism, which is extremely powerful, I believe. And then I will end my talk with the integration challenges and lessons learned. By the way, Yulia did an excellent job to, provide an overview of some, discussion of the presence of Ukrainian refugees in Germany. I think my talk will be complementary to hers. So, based on the most recent figures, there are slightly more than 3.7 million registered Syrian refugees in Turkey. In addition to that, there are also around 0.7 million refugees from Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, Sudan, Libya, Egypt, and other countries. Well, I think it is, I'm a bit hesitant to call those refugees because, well, the distinction is not that clear. Some of them are immigrants, but I think the convention is to call them refugee-like groups. So they are different from Syrian refugees. Well, definitely they are an interesting case, but I'm going to abstract from discussing the outcomes for those groups. I will mostly focus on the refugees, Syrian refugees in Turkey. But accounting for the refugee-like population and also accounting for the potentially unregistered ones in the country, there are more than 5 million refugees and refugee-like individuals in Turkey. So on average, especially Syrian refugees, they are younger and much less educated than the native population in Turkey. So it will not be wrong to call this refugee influx into Turkey a low-skilled population shock or a low-skilled labor supply shock, basically. When we look at the younger refugee population, there are around 1.3 million Syrian refugees of school age in Turkey. Well, also, I mean, they're going to grow fast. If you look at the fertility rates, the differences between fertility rates of Syrian and Turkish females, so the difference is stark. 5.4 versus 2.1. 2.1 is just the replacement fertility, so it looks like the Syrian school-age population will grow quite fast, even though there is no new entrance in the country, Syrian refugee entry into the country. Well, this figure suggests, I mean, we can conjecture that existing inequalities are large, and there are also risks for future inequalities, multidimensional inequalities in the Turkish society. In addition to that, because of this huge and rapid influx of more than 5 million individuals in the country, there is congestion in public service provision, especially in health and education services, and also in the use of public goods. Now I'm going to review the impact of the studies on investigating the impact of refugees on socioeconomic outcomes. I'm going to focus on 5 main outcomes: labor markets, education, consumer prices, productivity and trade, and crime. There are more outcomes, but I think these are the 5 main outcomes that the literature focuses on. So let me start with the labor market outcomes. So Syrian refugees, they initially didn't have work permit, but this didn't prevent them enter the labor market because Turkey has a large informal labor market. If you look at the non-agricultural employment workforce, so around 30 to 35% are informal. So they easily entered the labor market through informal jobs immediately. And they increased competition in the lower segment of the labor market, especially for informal jobs with manual tasks. And informal employment decreased and non-employment increased among natives. By non-employment, I mean unemployment increased and out of the labor force increased. And disadvantaged groups such as women and youth were affected the most from this substituting out effect. And also, well, if you look at the overall wages, there is no statistically significant impact, but if you focus on the wages of new entrants, we see a decline, a meaningful decline in the lower segment, especially. In the higher segments, on the other hand, there are complementarities that became effective. By complementaries, I mean in the production function, logic. If the supply of low-skilled labor goes up, then demand for high-skilled labor also goes up. So that complementarity is actually benefited formally employed, higher-skilled individuals, and we see some increase in the formal employment and wages of for the jobs with more advanced and complex tasks. Work permit became available after 2016, but there are bureaucratic barriers, and the application procedures are not easy, and that is position specific. That is issues upon the request of the firm. Firm has to claim that that position cannot be filled by native workforce, etc. So it is quite difficult to obtain. Therefore, the number of work permits remained negligible. Well, there is one more thing very interesting. There are large conditional cash transfer programs being implemented in Turkey to provide social protection to Syrian refugees in Turkey. But though the design of those programs actually incentivize informality, because the condition for receiving a cash transfer is not to receive income from any formal source. So this provides additional incentive to remain informal for Syrian refugees. That's also related to labor market outcomes, actually. When we focus on education, we see that for the higher secondary education, increased competition and reduced wages in the lower segment of the labor market affected the school outcomes of Turkish students. And in fact, we see an increase in the high school completion rates and PISA scores of native students. So this is particularly for students with lower educated parents. So there's actually a labor market channel operating in the background. There's also a school experience channel. I mean, what happens to the academic performance of the Turkish kids sitting in the same classroom for Syrian kids. So that's a work in progress. We have now access to administrative data to estimate the peer effects channel, but we don't have results yet. Hopefully in 5 or 6 months, I will be able to also talk about those issues. There's also, attempts to fully integrate Syrian kids to public education systems in Turkey, but that generated a native flight from public to private schools in Turkey. So there are some issues about the public education quality because of this congestion in the public education system, which is actually very important and critical policy dimension. When we look at the enrollment rates of refugees for primary, middle school, and high school, The enrollment rates are 98, 65, and 34% respectively. So we see that the enrollment rates significantly goes down with grade school level. And language barriers are significant, especially for the existing cohorts. Probably it's going to be less of a problem for the second generation and next generations, but now, I mean, it is a significant integration challenge for the existing young people. And it should be noted that dropping out tendency is significant at high school level for Syrian kids because of, transitioning into child labor, and also for female students, teenage marriages. When we look at consumer prices, so this is based on a 2016 paper published in Journal of Population Economics. So we find that inflation is lower for informal labor intensive goods and services produced in regions with high refugee intensity. So again, labor market channel is also effective here because there is a cost reduction effect of Syrian refugees, and this, informal refugee labor reduces the cost for certain goods and services. And as a side observation, in some regions and sectors especially, we see that the firms have become extremely reliant on refugee labor, and they become part of the competition environment in those regions and sectors. For productivity and trade, this is also a work in progress, but we have results to discuss. Well, the first observation is that in the country, there's an increased share of low-quality human capital, low-skilled individuals. So given the existence of this, new resource, firms respond to these, new incentives by investing less into technologically intensive physical capital. So this reduces the product quality and the quality of the export spectrum, and changes export destinations. So we see an overall decline in the quality of the production in the country. Firms are lagging behind the technology frontier. Investment in physical capital declines and productivity declines. And as a side note, green transition is now more difficult and risky because of increased, intensity of low-skilled and informal labor across the country. And this is a recent work, has just been released as an MBR working paper. We find an increase in crime, and the magnitude is around 220 property crimes. This is a milder form of crimes, not violent crimes, per 1,000 refugees per province per year. So we also find that crime increases with the number of refugees and low-skilled natives. This suggests that, again, the labor market mechanism is effective in the background. So the congestion in the lower segment of the labor market may also trigger some transition into illegal activities. And this also increases the crime across the country. But we do not say that refugees commit more crimes. We just see the overall increase in overall number of crimes. We are not able to distinguish between who commits the crime. It may be the case that the increase comes from the crimes committed by low-skilled natives. So this evidence should be interpreted with that in mind. So overall, it looks like, based on this wide spectrum of outcomes, the labor market channel looks like an extremely powerful mechanism that drives the impact of refugees on various socioeconomic outcomes. Because people respond to economic incentives, right? Therefore, what happens in the labor market, especially along the segments and margins where refugees and natives compete, following the influx, is the main determinant of the socioeconomic outcomes. So this is very important for policy because the way people respond to existing economic incentives, or firms respond to existing economic incentives in the labor market, really affects the other socioeconomic outcomes surrounding these economic incentives, such as education, crime, international trade, firm productivity, and etc. Consumer prices. And there are also other outcomes that I don't mention, such as health, fertility, life satisfaction, political preferences, etc. Now let me finish with lessons learned. First of all, these refugee movements, these are not transitory. There is always a permanent component that should be kept in mind. So there will not be an ultimate return in the medium term, right? And the persistence of the crisis will be correlated with how long the originating crisis will persist. Okay, so the policy design should be based on this perception, actually. That was one of the mistakes Turkey made. So Turkey was expecting that the crisis would resolve soon. I mean, they kept the Syrian refugees in the camps around the border until late 2014, and they wasted a lot of time in devising integration policies. And then after 2015, Russia got involved in the field in northern Syria, and then it became clear that the crisis will not be resolved soon, and therefore, I mean, then they started to design integration policies. So I think that should be kept in mind, that there is no quick and easy resolution to the background geopolitical issues. Second, I think Julia made a very good point on this issue. Policymakers should understand the potential tensions and develop realistic, sustainable, transparent, and accountable integration policies. This is very important. Responding early is very important, and hesitation is extremely costly, as I mentioned, but this doesn't mean that, I mean, this is also mentioned by Julia, responding early doesn't mean that integrating early. Responding early means to become aware of the problems early from a policymaker's perspective and start devising and designing policies early on, just to not to waste time, because otherwise people find ways to integrate which may generate undesired outcomes for both parties. And as I said, labor market mechanism is the main mechanism. There has to be an increased focus on labor market policies. And especially the focus should be on where people compete. Right, so for the Turkish case, this was the lower segment of the labor market. In Germany, this may be the upper segment of the labor market, right? So that margin is extremely important. And well, since in the Turkish case, refugees find a way to enter the labor market through informal work arrangement, which is a flexible way of entering the labor market. Well, this shows that improving labor market flexibility and also flex security may be very important to sustain labor market integration. But as I said, this is a complicated issue and should be discussed in more detail in other platforms. And fifth point, well, Europe should get ready for a massive second round movement within Europe. This doesn't mean that there will be an additional round of Ukrainian refugee inflow. It can be. But what I say is something different. If the crisis persists, and if we understand at some point that this will continue for a long period of time, then nowadays we see a clustering around like neighboring countries like Poland, Czech Republic, etc., Czechia. But after that point, Ukrainian refugees will try to find better opportunities, better economic opportunities across Europe. This may generate a second round internal movement within Europe. That happened in Turkey. So after 2015, Turkey experienced a huge internal movement of Syrian refugees. So we have nice graphs showing that if you compare the 2014 figures in Turkey with 2018, for example, we see a large spreading across the country, which can also happen in Europe. So that Europe should be prepared for that second round. Sixth, well, the education integration should start as early as possible. By early, I mean early childhood level, because that is the least costly way to intervene to school integration outcomes. So I think that is key, and there are several studies showing that. And finally, capacity of health and education services should be expanded early on, because it takes time to expand it. So that is a very critical issue, and it's a source of tension in the society. So that should be removed also early on. Because if governments do not act early, that may generate quality losses for the health and education services provided, which is a welfare loss for a society. Okay, thank you very much. This is the end of my talk, so let's discuss further after the first round. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Semih. Yeah, I mean, very important points. I understand the differences in the context, but I think some of the lessons that you mentioned are clearly relevant for the current case and also for future rounds, if there would be. And something that strike me, two things actually that strike me in what you showed also, the population projections. I think we had a quick chat about that yesterday also. I don't think that the number of Ukrainian refugees in Europe would, let's say we cannot really say something about that, but for the Turkish population, it's really striking, this 5.4 versus 2.1. So I heard in a very populistic video, I would say a few days ago, and I couldn't believe it, but now that you tell me that, I believe it now. And there were some projections that really look striking, like in 2050, the number of Syrian population in Turkey will be like quite significant. Anyway, that's a discussion for later. The second thing is this native flight from the public schooling. I found this also very interesting, and I wonder if that could be reproduced here. Something to think about. I don't know. I'm just wondering about it because I found it also striking when you mentioned that. Okay, I won't take too much time. We have to move to our third speaker, Silvia, next to me on my left. Silvia is a policy analyst in the European Migration and Diversity Program at the European Policy Center, EPC, based in Brussels. Her main fields of work include common European asylum system and its reform, legal migration, and the ongoing Ukraine displacement. She also worked at the European Parliament prior to joining the EPC, and today she will provide us an overview of the Temporary Protection Directive, as well as other measures put in place at the EU level in order to facilitate labor market integration. And also she will highlight some of the differences observed a little bit like Semih has done across refugees from different countries of origins. So Silvia, floor is yours now.
Thank you, Mehtab. So could you just show the slides, please? Many thanks. In the meantime, maybe I can start by saying that, yeah, I'll be talking about the Temporary Protection Directive in particular, and then move to the broader legal framework on integrating refugees in the EU labor market. And many thanks. So basically, this will be complementary to the other presentations, which were very interesting and maybe a bit more data and practice oriented. So I'll go back, let's say, to the legal basis and then walk you through the main, let's say, steps into integrating Ukrainian refugees in the labor market, and then also highlighting the differences with other, let's say, groups of refugees that do not benefit from the Temporary Protection Directive. So let me see if this works. Perfect. So the Temporary Protection Directive is an instrument that has been already adopted in 2001 and, as you may know, never activated before. So basically, this was really an unprecedented move in the EU asylum policies. And for all the migration experts in the room, I mean, you might know that it's extremely difficult for the member states to agree on something in the field of migration and asylum. So basically, the fact that this was activated at unanimity was quite groundbreaking, I would say. So very quickly on the personal scope of the directive, and this might seem a bit legalistic, but I think that it's also extremely important to differentiate and actually to know who are the categories of people that are included within temporary protection, because actually not all people fleeing Ukraine are granted the same rights and benefits. And of course, this also has some consequences on labor market integration perspectives. So the Temporary Protection Directive, or TPD, covers, of course, Ukrainian nationals that fled the country after the Russian invasion, but also those refugees that were already in Ukraine before that date, and their family members. However, non-Ukrainians, so third country nationals that reside in Ukraine, are not always able to avail themselves from temporary protection, and they can only do so if they were long-term residents and if they cannot make a safe return to their country of origin. And another important difference is that they don't have to be granted temporary protection, but actually an equivalent protection under member states' law. And this could take different forms and also grant access to different rights. So also important on the temporal scope, only people that fled after the 24th of February are covered. Of course, member states can be more generous, and some of them have also decided to extend protection to people that fled earlier or that were already in their territory. But this is not, let's say, mandated by EU law. And of course, we already talked about the temporal duration of temporary protection, which goes from 1 to 3 years maximum and is non-renewable. So this will certainly create potential, let's say, challenges and tensions in the longer term. So moving to the rights that beneficiaries of temporary protection have to be granted, here you can see some essential, basically references to the main rights. So residence permits, of course, which goes from 1 year to 3 years max. For the time being, temporary protection is until the 4th of March 2023, so it's the same duration for all the beneficiaries. Some member states have already granted longer temporary permits, but this is not the case for all those that apply temporary protection. So apart from access to the labor market, which we'll come to in a minute, of course, refugees also need to be given access to housing and proper accommodation, access to social welfare, and then to medical assistance, even if this doesn't mean full medical coverage, and there are different standards across member states. So on access to the labor market, people have to be given access to employment and self-employment to the same conditions as the nationals of the country. So they cannot be discriminated in terms of salary or other work conditions. However, of course, they have to be subject to professional rules. For example, let's think of doctor or nurses. So all the professions that are regulated can be also restricted to people that are beneficiaries of temporary protection. And again, the difference that I mentioned earlier is quite relevant here, because people that will be protected under national law and not under the temporary protection framework might not have the same right to access the labor market immediately. So I think these are some very important things to be kept in mind. So moving forward, and another very important point in terms of EU policies and temporary protection is that with another unprecedented move, the European member states have decided that people will be able to choose the states where they want to receive temporary protection. And this is also not the case for other refugees, which are normally covered by the Dublin regulation rules, meaning that they need to ask for protection in the first state in which they entered. So basically here we also see the origin of many of the imbalances within the common European asylum system. And this will also be very interesting going forward, because we will be able to see whether people free choice actually has benefit also in terms of integration perspective. And another point that I wanted to highlight is that temporary protection also gives people the possibility to move within Europe to a certain extent, and potentially also to, for example, go back to Ukraine and come back to the country where they have protection. So this is also good to explain some of the return movements to Ukraine, because people might be coming back just for family reasons or, for example, to help someone else escaping, but not really be returning in Ukraine in the longer term. So colleagues earlier have already presented some interesting data about the distribution of Ukrainian beneficiaries of temporary protection. But apart from looking at arrivals, I think it's also very interesting to start looking at where people are registering for temporary protection. So basically, if in the beginning of the, let's say, crisis, people were staying in the countries neighboring Ukraine, they later on started moving across the EU, and in particular in those member states where there is a large Ukrainian community refugee or diaspora. So Poland is the main country that is for now registering people for temporary protection, but it's actually the only country bordering Ukraine that is also retaining the Ukrainian, let's say, displaced community. Whereas a lot of people are moving to Germany, the Czech Republic, Italy, Spain, and Bulgaria, which are all states that already had a big presence of Ukrainian migrants. And people are, of course, often finding accommodation through family and friends in this first phase. However, and this is also maybe shown in this map, however, of course, data collection, as it has been highlighted, is not yet complete. For example, Eurostat only gets information that has been voluntarily provided by the member states. So it's always very good to cross-check data through different sources. UNHCR has some can be found through Eurostat and the Commission, but it is also very difficult for now to capture the trends. However, this, let's say, onward movement or decision basically to ask for temporary protection, not in the member states, closer to Ukraine, seems to be already a trend that we can confirm. And this will be important also in terms of labor market integration, of course, because different member states have different integration policies. They have potentially different labor shortages. So it has to be seen how these things might match, let's say, in the medium term. But now, moving quickly to some of the measures that the EU has taken to support labor market integration. Of course, employment as well as integration are primarily member states' competencies. So this has to be remembered when we look at the actions taken from the EU. So apart from the activation of the Temporary Protection Directive, the European Commission has also engaged in a lot of measures in support to member states. And also, I must say, puts together a very big information campaign targeting Ukrainians directly. And this is also very important in order to make them, of course, aware of the rights that they have across the EU. But looking at the labor market, and I think that the first presentation highlighted this very well, some of the priorities will be about skills and qualifications recognition and then job matching. So in this sense, there is a lot of guidance from the EU, which is mainly encouraging member states to use the most generous provisions possible to welcome Ukrainian refugees, meaning, for example, speeding up procedures in terms of recognition of academic qualifications that normally might take time, but also trying, let's say, to minimize the other barriers in terms of access to the labor market. There have been also some of the EU tools that have been translated into Ukrainian, for example, to help people basically create skills profile and CVs that they can use also to find employment in the EU. And there have been also some measures put in place to support member states authorities and Ukrainian authorities to determine the equivalence of diplomas and academic qualifications. And then in terms of job matching, there is an upcoming initiative which I think is going to be very interesting. So the establishment of a EU-level web platform for job matching. So this EU talent pool, which is a measure that the Commission has announced also more broadly for other groups of migrants and refugees. But however, it will have this pilot phase only for Ukrainians, and it will be launched very soon. So I think that will be a very interesting thing to monitor. So in terms of funding, there has been also some additional flexibility in terms of the funding that can be used by member states to respond to this displacement crisis. There have also been some critiques because basically this is not new funding, but often just repurposing of other funding instruments that were already available, for example, for cohesion purposes or general migration and integration. But now some lessons I wrote to be learned, because of course it's very difficult to draw conclusions already. So there are some trends, there are some interesting points that we can look at, but of course we don't know, first of all, how much a displacement will last. We don't have a very strong future perspective. So there are some points that can be taken into consideration, both in terms of employment policies and of course migration and asylum policies. And I will try to highlight some. And as I said in the beginning, and maybe I can move a bit quickly on this slide, but basically integration and employment are competencies of the member states. So there is also, let's say, a risk that there will be a different level of harmonization across the EU, because the temporary protection scheme only provides for a set of baseline rights, but then member states can go in different directions. And a point that I also wanted to mention, and that has already been, of course, clear from the previous presentations, is that integration is multidimensional. So it's very strongly dependent on other factors. And of course, housing is a key one, but also social protection and services, especially from a gender perspective, childcare and education for children in the first place. And the point on housing is also a bit concerning, because of course we're talking about employment here, but people need to be housed close to where employments are, close to where schools for children are. And for the time being, after that, the initial wave of support from a lot of volunteers, but also family members of displaced Ukrainian, let's say, had started for 3 months. Now people are not getting enough money. They're experiencing some initial challenges in hosting people, and it will be very important that also long-term housing is found for all the basically people displaced from Ukraine. So, but as I mentioned in the beginning, the temporary protection directive activation is also to be considered as an extraordinary measure that is targeting a specific group of refugees. In fact, what we see, and what is one of the main benefits that has also been highlighted in the initial presentation, is that TPD gives access to the labor market from day one. And this has not always been the case for previous, basically, groups of refugees that normally have to undergo very lengthy procedures, sometimes waiting 1 or 2 years before getting their status, and also experiencing difficulties in applying for jobs when they don't know whether they will receive that legal status or not. So apart from that, of course, there is also the free choice of the country of destination, which is certainly a very good point, which is not given to all the other refugees. And then, however, there is also a challenge, meaning that the duration of temporary protection is quite short, so these 3 years, and legal solutions will need to be found to enable Ukrainians that cannot return to Ukraine to also stay in the EU territory. There is always, of course, access to regular asylum procedures, but that might reveal complex, because there would be millions of people then applying for asylum in 3 years. So the main difference, I would say, here is between temporary protection beneficiaries, asylum applicants, and then recognized refugees. And I would say that here the most vulnerable category is the one of asylum applicants, because those are the ones that have less legal certainties, a waiting period before being able to access the labor market, and of course also often being object of discrimination, in addition to all the other challenges that are common to all refugees. So language barriers, and of course, finding themselves in a new country where they have maybe limited family, friends, and other social links that can help them in their integration pathway. So what lessons to be learned? We know that temporary protection is an extraordinary and somehow very positive way of welcoming people displaced from a war. And it can also be very interesting in terms of EU policies, as it can be the test model for free choice of refugees. Because so far, one of the main, let's say, shortcomings of the asylum system has been that people are forced to remain in a certain country. There have been high secondary movement and also high, of course, very difficult debates between states as for the question of responsibility sharing. Of course, this will also be very useful in terms of research and policy making in order to evaluate the benefits of the immediate access to the labor market. But of course, this needs to be combined with certainties in terms of the temporal duration of the protection given. And of course, I haven't had a lot of time to discuss this, but then the gender-specific barriers have been very described by previous speakers, and this will be also a key in the context of displacement from Ukraine. So gender-sensitive labor market inclusion policies will be fundamental. This will also be interesting from a research perspective, I would say, because it will allow us to collect data and to figure out which kind of policies are more effective when looking at female refugees, especially, of course, in this case, single parents, which is a category which is particularly, let's say, vulnerable within, the Ukrainian displacement community. So some final lessons in terms also of EU policies, and looking at the challenges. One thing that might be quite complex in the future is how to even out the fragmentation in terms of rights given across the member states. So some member states might grant very generous provisions, very generous, for example, housing or social benefits, whereas others may already restrict protection. And there have been some that have, for example, not being very keen on protecting third country nationals fleeing Ukraine. So we already see some challenges in terms of personal scope of the protection, but that might be more, that might encourage people to move across Europe. And this was what the last presentation also talked about. There might be some incentives for people not to remain in a certain country if they don't have sufficient access to employment, to benefit, if children cannot be integrated in schools. So this remains to be seen, but of course, much also depends from how the situation in Ukraine will evolve. So we already mentioned the legal status for the beneficiaries. And one final point, especially from the perspective of the development of asylum policies, is how the UN member states will be able to tackle this differentiation that now it's emerging between the temporary protection beneficiaries and all the other refugees. Because we continue seeing very harsh border policies, for example, a lot of limitations and divergences in terms of access to asylum and protection within the EU for people coming from other regions. So this will certainly be a major problem, as there have been already a lot of, let's say, criticism from NGOs, from refugee groups themselves, as for the privileged treatment, let's say, that Ukrainians are receiving. And of course, not to say that this is not the correct way to respond to a crisis, but then this sort of very prompt response, very generous response should also be translated and extended to other groups. So one last thing I wanted to show you is a podcast episode that the EPC recently produced, and that is really looking at the gender perspective into supporting women into labor market integration in the context of the Ukrainian displacement crisis. So if you're interested in learning more, you can also look for this online. It's freely available, and have a listen. So thanks a lot for your attention, and looking forward to the discussion. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Silvia. Yeah, not being from a legal background, but I think I've learned quite a bit of things today from this TPD, the Temporary Protection Directive, which from the way I understand, it kind of bypass the asylum procedure completely, which has been a big challenge early on, as you also said. And it also is a little bit behind these irregular movements, the secondary movements in Europe, which has been the case, right, with the previous wave. And also I think it's also impacting very much the duration of 1 to 3 years. The incentives on, okay, it's not a long time, but it's not like 6 months either. So you can still decide to invest on some language and country-specific human capital. So it really changes a lot of the incentive mechanisms of the refugees themselves, if they know that they're going to stay in the country for the next 3 years, or if they don't know where they will end up, and maybe they will just irregularly go somewhere else. So it's a complete change of scene and ecosystem of action. So it's really very interesting, and thank you for all these details. So I don't see any question online, so then we just go ahead with the questions in the room. So who wants to ask a question? I see Bella's hand, I see Zane's hand, my dear colleagues, and Franklin, my other dear colleague. So we start with Bella, Zane, and Franklin. So maybe please introduce yourself. I know you, but not everyone knows
hello,
you.
I'm Bela Galgot, CTUI, and we have conducted a research on the 2015-16 refugee wave and labor market integration practices in Europe. What I would like to say now, sorry, and apologize myself first, I'm really feeling uncomfortable about this discussion. Not exactly about what took, but in general. I mean, so because of many things. So first of all, what happened in Ukraine is, well, it is unthinkable, yeah? So would we discuss the same thing when the Netherlands was invading Flanders? So I mean, it is completely a nonsensical situation, in one hand. The other is that Europe's response to the 2015-16 refugee situation was a catastrophe. It was a disaster. I mean, I cannot find words for that. So we need to reflect on that too. And also the contrast. So I mean, it's not only that not having a common migration policy, but on national level. And it was not only the Salvini stuff, and in Austria with the far right, not to speak about Poland and Hungary, but Denmark, Finland, France was just talking. So I mean, it was complete disaster, and also so that is the one thing, and so it's rather contrasting, and that's why I would be very cautious to draw kind of parallels or learn. What can we learn? We didn't learn anything from the 15, 16. Europe's disaster, not the migration, was disaster. And also, and then from a more sober point of view, we don't really know the motives, so the push factors. This is displacement. Indeed, the country is 20% of the country is occupied, so it's not the whole country. Like in Syria, we don't know the time horizon, nothing. So in that, of course, integration itself. Well, so there are many questions.
Okay, you have to move on, Ben.
Sorry.
But I see what you mean, but I disagree in the sense that I think we should still talk about things, because if we just, I mean, as researchers, as policy, people, we have to reflect on what has been learned. I mean, policymakers may not have learned, political leaders may not have learned their lessons, but it's our job to tell them what happened so that they can draw lessons.
And also, hopefully. Sorry, one last word, what I really feel troubling, there is a little bit of discriminatory character of this.
Yeah, that's so the elephant in the room.
With the Muslim, non-European population one way, and with the Christian white population.
Thank you for saying that. I think that's the elephant in the room. I agree with you. Let's go. Thank you, Bella. Zane.
Thank you. So I think I take it in a bit of a, more positive way, that we actually have learned the lessons and we are directing very differently, and they're at least to an extent in Europe. So, and then hopefully we react like this rather than we react like we used to. So I think that's how I take it. Maybe I'm extremely optimistic. So what I wanted to ask was a little bit, I'm wondering, what is your experience, and is there any data on refugee voice in the host society? So how are they sort of, because I know that there is a lot of informal organization, etc., but when it comes to, for example, labor market integration, also sort of a formal structures like trade unions are key. So this is awesome. This is my question: is there any data on how refugees, represent their voice? Do they are allowed active voice? Because sometimes it seems to me that often sort of they are given sort of passive role in this story to an extent, and sort of given some individual possibility, but not sort of a collective voice. So
voice like a political party,
political voice, but also organizational voice. Okay, what happens at NGOs, but also what happens in the labor market integration in terms of collective voice. Is there any, especially data from Turkey, I guess, but also in Germany for the from the first wave when Crimea was occupied? So,
I mean, a very quick reaction to this, but I will leave to Julia and Semi as well. The European Social Survey is collecting some questions on active citizenship. I wonder if you could, and you have a country of birth there, and I don't think there's a refugee status, but there's a migrant status. So you could tease out some information there, but maybe there are other specific surveys done, and that I will leave to Julia and Semi. Yeah, you can, where they are born, you could kind of, but the samples are small too, the migrant samples. So this is my quick answer, but maybe they have other answers. And Frank Lau, please, and then we'll come to the response.
Yeah,
Frank
Kimbimbi, education officer at the TUI. Yeah, I have a question for Sylvia. I'd like to know, because I have not the feeling that we have heard the UNHCR position about the temporary protection directive. Could you have some info about that?
Yes. Okay, I saw one more hand here, and please, if you can introduce yourself quickly.
Michiel Lodijk from the Dutch Education Union. I'm also appalled by the discrimination between refugees from one country and refugees from another country. And I wonder if there has been any consultation with the well, either the European Court of Human Rights or the European Court of Justice, because I think this is such a discrimination that it could lead to court cases.
Okay, shall we respond, our dear speakers? So, Julio, do you want to go first, maybe? If you have something to reply to, or maybe on the survey, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, we do have surveys. We have this wonderful ERB bump survey of refugees, which is representative for refugees arrived between 2013 and 2016. And this has plenty, I mean, 450 questions every year. It's amazing. And we ask various aspects, also active citizenship, but this is not my topic or not my research topic. That is why I cannot really develop my answer in that direction, but it could be analyzed, and we learn a lot from this data. What I can say, and we, like, at least from my side and side of my colleagues, we provide a lot of policy report advices on different aspects of integration based on this data, based on the kind of voice of refugees. And the same is aimed for Ukrainian refugees. So we are gathering similar type of data, which will be then integrated so that we can compare. I wanted to add on the discrimination aspect, which is raised several times here. Indeed, I agree that Ukrainian refugees are treated very differently, but what is the alternative? I mean, to say that we will not treat them differently and they should be treated the same as this was the case for 2015 refugees, I don't think it is a kind of solution. But what we should learn is that these new policies which are created for Ukrainian refugees should be extended and applied for all refugees since now and for the future.
We hope so. Semi, maybe you want to go first, and then Sylvia.
I also want to briefly respond to this refugee voice, survey data, etc. I think it's a critical issue because, especially speaking in terms of the Syrian refugees in Turkey, there is scarcity of micro refugee data, definitely. I think Germany does a better job relative to Turkey in this respect. There is no systematic representative survey data, also asking various questions and their perceptions, subjective opinions, well-being, etc. On Syrian refugees. Now the standard surveys, such as the labor force survey, started to capture also Syrian refugees. So now these new waves of those kind of national representative surveys, slightly not in a representative way, but capturing Syrian refugees, but still, there is no enough data to answer that question. There are some qualitative studies done in the field, but representativeness of those studies, always questionable because the sample size is quite low. They focus on very specific questions, so they are not general enough. It's also not my field, so I cannot speak of those studies. But there are some quite rich administrative data sources, such as student databases and also some social security records for registered formally employed refugees, but access to those data is also problematic because of confidentiality issues. But I think over time, these data sets will become available to researchers use, and more survey data will become available. Unfortunately, those kind of questions will be answered with a lag. That's my understanding.
Okay, yeah, maybe I can try to respond to the 4 remarks and questions. So starting from the first, I think I interpreted the question of the panel as to what lessons can be learned from the present context for the future, rather than what lessons can we learn from the past, because in that case, I would definitely say that, there are lessons learned as to what shouldn't be done. when welcoming refugees. So that's certainly maybe one first perspective. And then the second one, I think there has been on integration and the prospects for people, let's say, to return to Ukraine, the fact that some parts of the territory might be perceived as safe. That's, of course, very difficult to say in this context, and to some extent also justifies basically the temporality of protection, and people themselves want to return in this case. I mean, they often are in a bit of a limbo, especially in these first months. I think that the Ukrainian government itself is pushing for people to return as soon as possible in the short term. So let's say that there are questions that go beyond what we usually see for refugee movements. And I think that is a very, let's say, interesting concept that has been advanced by the OECD and some integration experts, being the one of the dual intent of integration policies, meaning helping people to integrate where they arrive, but also creating skills and maintaining skills for a future return in their country of origin, which is particularly fitting for the Ukrainian context. So as for the data on the refugee voices, in the context of displacement from Ukraine, I think it is also an interesting innovation. For example, the European Union Asylum Agency has conducted a survey on people displaced from Ukraine, and the results, I think the preliminary results, were published yesterday, and you can find this online. So they've started asking questions to people as to the level of rights they've received, their aspirations, where they would like to move, and this was certainly not done. And I mean, it's easier because you have a certain group of people that receives protection, so of course it's also easier to understand who are the beneficiaries, but this might be also an interesting test for the future. And this is just anecdotally, I mean, I've seen an unprecedented also willingness to involve Ukrainians in the conversation. Like, for example, yesterday I was reading an article about the Brussels municipality efforts to find housing for Ukrainians, and one of the representatives of the Brussels government said, no decision without Ukrainians. And I was completely surprised, because this is definitely not what we see usually when we talk about refugee integration and migration policies. There is a lot of tokenism. So definitely now we're seeing different trends. And one last thing, there is also the diaspora engagement, which is very strong, of course. So they are trying to make Ukrainian voices heard. And there is also a very good organization working in Brussels. I don't know if you know it, Promote Ukraine. They are also, of course, advocating a lot as for labor market integration and this kind of issues. So you can certainly check them out if you haven't done so yet. So on the UNHCR position, I mean, well, it's quite interesting because UNHCR looks specifically at refugees. And in this case, there might be some questions as to whether Ukrainians would actually fit the refugee definition. So basically, I mean, yeah, they wouldn't strictly fall under the UNHCR mandate. The UNHCR, of course, is, I mean, as far as I've seen so far, very happy about temporary protection schemes in the EU and beyond, because I think that since the comparison is what happened in the past, it's very difficult to advocate for more, because in a certain sort of sense, temporary protection could be less protective than refugee status. But what's problematic is what comes in between. So basically the asylum procedures, access to rights during that period of time, etc. So having temporary protection is certainly way easier and effective than refugee status in this case, and specifically in the EU context. So far I've only heard enthusiastic UNHCR representatives across panels and, of course, in their position papers. And I think this is way more that they would have achieved in other refugee situations. So on discrimination and consultations with the courts, I think that here in terms of legal perspectives, it's difficult because, as I said, the refugee definition does not strictly apply. Potentially people fleeing Ukraine could fall under subsidiary protection, so risk of serious harm, but then it would be an individual assessment, whereas temporary protection is a group assessment. So basically people are sort of automatically given the status if they enter some criteria. So in terms of access to the Court of Justice of the European Union, individuals don't have access to it. So it would take, for example, a national court that wants to interpret the application of the Temporary Protection Directive at the national level. And this could come in the future, for example, to challenge the fact that some categories of people are not granted access to rights. Other ways, of course, the European Court of Human Rights could also intervene, especially, I mean, when we saw the issues at the borders, you know, the reports about African students, for example, not being able to escape. Those would have been situations in which the court could have intervened. However, there was also a very strong push from the European Commission on states not to discriminate. And so far, we have seen a lot of attention to this topic, at least in the, let's say, framework of border crossings. In the framework of access to right, is probably going to be way more at the national level. So it's very interesting to see what's happening there. I mean, in terms of member states not applying asylum EU standards in terms of temporary protection, there are already some problems in the usual suspects, Hungary, etc. However, I guess that the fact that people have free movement will also basically be a guarantee, in the sense that the European Commission, who would have potentially enforcement powers vis-à-vis the member states, is not very keen on acting on this kind of, let's say, violations, and I wouldn't foresee any strong action also to prevent this, at least maybe behind closed doors, but not directly. So yeah, let's see what the future holds.
Great. We can maybe go for our second round. We have, so because we started 15 minutes late, I would like to stop at 45 if there are no more questions, but so that means that we have like 9 minutes. So I saw some hands there, the lady, and also next to you, I think. You wanted to ask a question too? Okay, well then go ahead, please. Introduce yourself, please.
My name is Joan Delaney. I'm a founding member of the Maison du Peuple d'Europe, and we've been up and running. It's a think tank in the civil society sector. Just a couple of very brief remarks. This whole Ukrainian crisis may well come full circle. It's unfortunate that it's taken this to jolt people into action, because it has been a little bit of an eye-opener that suddenly there was action. I think, without wanting to give an escape route to anybody, I think it's partly explained by the proximity and the emergency and the urgency with which it all arose. But it's an eye-opener. And just on that particular question, we are working with Afghans who risk to be forgotten in this whole story. And the Americans pulled out. There's not a lot that seems to be possible about the political situation in the shorter term. And I won't say the Afghans themselves are trying to keep themselves going. And I'm saying anything that can be done, if you can mention Afghanistan, if you can add it to your panel discussions, if you can keep it in the list of, keep the focus on it, I think it would help. And the crisis length has been too long. That also brings down the recall in people's minds. So just say a word for Afghanistan. Thank you.
Any other question, remarks? We have a few more minutes. Okay, anyone wants to react? I mean, I think Semi mentioned Afghanistan in the refugee-like groups when you were mentioning the groups in Turkey.
Yeah, let me briefly talk about what I know on this issue. So first of all, the case of people from Afghanistan, especially in Turkey, is different from the case of Syrian refugees in Turkey. The reason, as I mentioned in my talk, is that it is very difficult to, label the movement of people out of Afghanistan. So it is definitely not a sudden outflow of refugees, right? So there's an ongoing crisis. There are ups and downs in political situation in Afghanistan. There are periods of increased violence, increased turmoil, and then more silent periods, etc. But there is rather a continuous outflow of, especially young people, from Afghanistan toward the Western world. Well, Turkey received around 300 to 400,000 people, individuals from Afghanistan, mostly young males. They behave differently. They're mostly employed in construction and agriculture, unlike Syrian refugees. Syrian refugees, there is a similarity between the sectoral composition of Aleppo and the southeastern part of Turkey. So Syrian refugees are mostly employed in textiles, food manufacturing, some certain services, some certain chemical manufacturing industries, which has like forward and backward links with textiles. So the sectoral composition is also different. The working habits also different. People from Afghanistan are more persistent. They're more attached to work, but they're more willing to move toward the West. So they tend to see Turkey as a transition country rather than a terminal target country. So that's what I know. Well, the reason it is difficult to analyze people from Afghanistan is that the tendency to be unregistered is much higher for people from Afghanistan because, you know, they unfortunately travel by foot from Afghanistan to Turkey, transpassing Iran, the mountains, etc. So it was a long way, and you know they're more likely to be unregistered, and they are more likely economic migrants, right? Even if we have like data, it is very difficult to analyze their situations because of selectivity issues, etc. This is like, you know, very classical discussion in economics literature, econometric discussion. Well, this is what I know about people from Afghanistan. But I agree. I mean, that is, you know, the fact that it is not an immediate humanitarian issue does not hinder the importance of the issue. I think that, but they are so dispersed that across countries, across Europe, neighboring countries, and you know all over the world, that it is not easy to, you know, to draw a unified picture to understand their situation. So that's my initial reaction. But I agree, that's quite important.
Yeah, I totally agree, because I also have a personal anecdote about Afghans in Turkey. I know that my mother met an Afghan who was basically doing this triage of the trash in front of our house in Istanbul, and then she talked with him. I learned about after, because I saw him as well afterwards. He basically has a civil engineering diploma. And because he couldn't transfer his skills, so he couldn't find a formal job. So he's doing the, you know, paper collection. He's separating plastics and papers and trash. So it's heartbreaking. But I'm very glad that you mentioned that, because there are many cases like that, not Afghans only, but also here, if you look at the Ukrainian, like high-skilled women who are being offered cleaning jobs. Oh, well, yeah, that's an easy go to titre de service. You know, those who live in Brussels, they know what I mean. So it's terrible, but I'm very glad that you mentioned the Afghan case, because it's actually has been ongoing since some decades. Anyway, unless there are, like, we have 3 minutes, we can also stop now. Unless there are questions, I think we can close the panel here, so you can enjoy your coffees outside. Thank you very much, Julia, for joining us today, our speakers who came today, and all of you for being here. I really enjoyed. I hope you also enjoyed the panel. We will have this break now, and the next wrap-up session will be at 11 o'clock. It will be a plenary session, so I welcome you to that session as well. So thank you very much, and have a good rest of the day. Thank you.